Wicked is a fantasy musical drama film released in 2024 and directed by John M. Chu, based on the famous Broadway musical inspired by the novel written by Gregory Maguire and connected to the magical world of The Wizard of Oz. The movie was produced by Universal Pictures and stars Cynthia Erivo as Elphaba and Ariana Grande as Glinda alongside Jonathan Bailey, Jeff Goldblum, and Michelle Yeoh. The film combines fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, politics, discrimination, and magical musical performances while visually creating the colorful world of Oz through giant fantasy sets, magical effects, glowing cities, massive costumes, flying creatures, emotional cinematography, and beautiful musical choreography. Meanwhile, emotionally, the movie explores themes of loneliness, rejection, identity, friendship, manipulation, emotional isolation, and how society often misunderstands people who are different from everyone else around them. The story begins in the magical land of Oz after news spreads that the feared Wicked Witch of the West has finally died. Meanwhile, huge celebrations begin across towns and fantasy streets as citizens sing, dance, and celebrate what they believe is the end of evil. Visually, the opening scenes are grand and colorful with glowing lights, giant fantasy buildings, magical costumes, floating decorations, energetic musical performances, and massive crowds celebrating throughout the kingdom. Meanwhile, Glinda arrives surrounded by sparkling magic and elegance while people excitedly question her about the Wicked Witch because rumors spread that she once personally knew her before becoming enemies. Emotionally, Glinda becomes quieter and emotionally reflective because despite the terrifying public image of the Wicked Witch, she remembers someone very different beneath the fear and hatred spread across Oz. Meanwhile, the movie transitions into the emotional backstory explaining how Elphaba and Glinda first met many years earlier before destiny transformed them into legendary rivals inside Oz history. Meanwhile, Elphaba is introduced during her painful childhood where she is constantly treated as strange and unwanted because of her green skin. Emotionally, her early life is filled with rejection, embarrassment, loneliness, and emotional pain because even her own family struggles to fully accept her appearance. Meanwhile, her younger sister Nessarose receives far more affection and sympathy while Elphaba quietly hides emotional hurt behind sarcasm, anger, and defensive behavior. Visually, these childhood scenes use darker lighting, emotional silence, uncomfortable family interactions, and isolated framing to show how emotionally alone Elphaba feels while growing up inside a society obsessed with appearances and normality. Meanwhile, strange magical powers begin appearing whenever Elphaba loses emotional control, causing objects to move violently and magical energy to erupt unexpectedly around her. Emotionally, these frightening moments make both Elphaba and the people around her fear the dangerous power hidden inside her emotions because nobody fully understands the strength she secretly possesses. Meanwhile, society inside Oz increasingly discriminates against anyone different or unusual, which slowly shapes Elphaba's anger, emotional isolation, and distrust toward the world around her. Meanwhile, the story moves to Shiz University where magical students from across Oz study academics, politics, and magical arts inside a visually spectacular fantasy campus filled with giant towers, colorful gardens, glowing classrooms, floating decorations, magical creatures, elegant uniforms, and enormous fantasy architecture that creates one of the most visually beautiful locations in the movie. Emotionally, Elphaba immediately struggles socially because other students whisper, stare, mock, and avoid her due to her unusual appearance, which reinforces her belief that society will never fully accept her no matter how intelligent or kind she tries to be. Meanwhile, Glinda is introduced as the complete opposite of Elphaba because she is beautiful, popular, fashionable, cheerful, socially admired, and constantly surrounded by attention everywhere she goes. Visually, Glinda's introduction is filled with bright colors, glamorous costumes, sparkling magical effects, playful humor, energetic choreography, and lively musical performances that sharply contrast Elphaba's darker emotional atmosphere and loneliness. Meanwhile, beneath Glinda's cheerful personality exists emotional insecurity because she constantly seeks approval and validation from others around her while trying to maintain the perfect image society expects from her. Meanwhile, unexpected circumstances force both girls to become roommates despite their opposite personalities and emotional worlds. Emotionally, their first interactions are filled with irritation, awkwardness, sarcasm, judgment, and constant conflict because neither understands the other's struggles or emotional perspective. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes embarrassed by Elphaba's unusual behavior while Elphaba sees Glinda as spoiled, shallow, privileged, and emotionally insensitive toward people treated unfairly by society. Visually, the movie uses funny dormitory scenes, awkward arguments, musical performances, emotional misunderstandings, chaotic situations, and playful humor to slowly build their complicated relationship. Meanwhile, beneath their constant conflict, small moments begin revealing hidden emotional vulnerability because Glinda slowly notices Elphaba's loneliness while Elphaba starts realizing Glinda's confidence hides emotional pressure and insecurity created by society's expectations surrounding beauty, popularity, and perfection. Meanwhile, the political atmosphere inside Oz slowly becomes darker beneath the colorful fantasy world because intelligent animals who can speak and teach begin mysteriously losing rights and disappearing from society due to increasing discrimination created by powerful political leaders controlling Oz. Emotionally, these developments deeply affect Elphaba because she strongly empathizes with anyone judged, feared, or mistreated simply for being different or powerless. Meanwhile, one of her professors secretly recognizes the extraordinary magical ability hidden inside Elphaba and believes she possesses powers unlike anything previously seen inside Oz. Emotionally, this attention both excites and frightens Elphaba because for the first time someone recognizes her potential instead of only fearing her appearance. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly becomes curious about Elphaba despite their differences because beneath the awkward arguments and emotional conflict she starts seeing intelligence, pain, emotional strength, and loneliness hidden beneath Elphaba's defensive personality. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, political tension, magical mystery, friendship, emotional healing, discrimination, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, prejudice, loneliness, and misunderstanding can slowly transform emotionally wounded people into the figures society eventually labels as villains. Wicked continues as life inside Shiz University slowly forces Elphaba and Glinda to spend more time together despite their constant arguments, emotional misunderstandings, and completely opposite personalities. Emotionally, Elphaba continues feeling isolated because nearly everyone around her judges her appearance before understanding who she truly is, while Glinda remains socially admired and constantly surrounded by attention, compliments, and popularity. Visually, the university remains filled with enormous fantasy architecture, glowing magical classrooms, floating decorations, colorful gardens, elaborate costumes, giant libraries, and musical energy that creates a magical atmosphere, while emotionally darker tensions quietly grow beneath the beauty and excitement of student life. Meanwhile, Elphaba struggles to control her increasingly powerful magic because her emotions continue triggering dangerous magical reactions whenever she becomes angry, embarrassed, or emotionally overwhelmed. Emotionally, these moments frighten her because she fears becoming dangerous or losing control completely, while people around her already see her as strange and frightening due to her appearance. Meanwhile, one of the university's important professors, Madame Morrible, begins taking special interest in Elphaba after witnessing the extraordinary strength of her magical abilities. Emotionally, Elphaba feels confused by this sudden attention because for most of her life she experienced rejection rather than admiration from authority figures. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible encourages Elphaba to further develop her magical talent and hints that her powers could eventually bring her into contact with the mysterious Wizard of Oz himself, who rules the kingdom with enormous political influence and magical authority. Emotionally, this possibility deeply excites Elphaba because she secretly hopes the wizard may finally help her feel accepted inside society and perhaps even discover a way to change her green appearance, which caused emotional pain throughout her entire life. Meanwhile, Glinda continues enjoying popularity, social attention, and admiration across campus through fashionable appearances, playful charm, cheerful musical performances, and energetic personality. Visually, her scenes remain bright, Glamorous, colorful, and filled with sparkling magical effects that contrast Elphaba's darker emotional atmosphere and isolation. However, emotionally, Glinda slowly begins realizing that popularity does not automatically create genuine emotional connection because many people around her only admire the image she presents rather than understanding her real insecurities and emotional fears hidden beneath her cheerful personality. Meanwhile, her relationship with the handsome and charismatic Prince Fiyero introduces additional emotional tension into the story because Fiyero immediately attracts attention across the university due to his confidence, charm, humor, and rebellious attitude towards strict academic expectations. Visually, his arrival creates energetic excitement through musical performances, extravagant costumes, playful choreography, and humorous interactions with students who quickly become fascinated by his carefree personality. Meanwhile, emotionally, Glinda becomes attracted to Fiyero because he represents excitement, romance, popularity, and the glamorous life she always imagined for herself. However, Fiyero quickly notices Elphaba's emotional honesty and intelligence beneath her defensive personality, which slowly creates emotional chemistry neither initially expects. Meanwhile, the discrimination against talking animals inside Oz continues, becoming more serious and politically disturbing as professors disappear from the university and animal citizens increasingly lose social rights. Emotionally, these developments deeply upset Elphaba because she strongly empathizes with anyone mistreated simply for being different or powerless within society. Meanwhile, many students choose ignoring the situation because political injustice feels easier to avoid when it does not personally affect their comfortable lives. Emotionally, this frustrates Elphaba because she begins realizing how easily society allows cruelty and discrimination to grow whenever fear and convenience become more important than compassion and justice. Meanwhile, Glinda initially pays little attention to these darker political developments because she remains focused on popularity, romance, fashion, and social status. However, slowly spending time with Elphaba begins challenging her worldview and forcing her to notice suffering and unfairness she previously ignored or misunderstood. As both girls continue sharing dormitory space, their relationship slowly becomes less hostile despite constant awkwardness, arguments, and emotional misunderstandings. Visually, the movie uses humorous late-night conversations, chaotic dormitory scenes, accidental emotional moments, playful musical numbers, and awkward social situations to gradually build emotional connection between them. Meanwhile, Glinda unexpectedly witnesses Wicked continues as the growing friendship between Elphaba and Glinda slowly becomes one of the most emotionally important relationships inside the story despite their completely different personalities. Emotionally, Elphaba still struggles with loneliness, insecurity, and years of emotional rejection while Glinda continues balancing her cheerful public image with hidden emotional fears about popularity, beauty, and social acceptance. Visually, Shiz University remains filled with colorful fantasy architecture, glowing magical classrooms, floating decorations, elegant costumes, giant libraries, sparkling magical effects, and energetic musical performances that create a beautiful fantasy atmosphere while darker emotional and political tensions continue quietly growing beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Elphaba's magical abilities become increasingly powerful and unstable because her emotions strongly influence her magic whenever she feels anger, sadness, fear, or emotional frustration. Emotionally, this frightens her because she worries that her powers may eventually hurt innocent people or transform her into exactly the kind of frightening figure society already believes she is. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues encouraging Elphaba's magical education while secretly manipulating her emotional desire for acceptance and recognition because she understands how valuable Elphaba's extraordinary power could become within the political system controlling Oz. Emotionally, Elphaba remains hopeful that her growing abilities may eventually allow her to meet the wizard and finally gain acceptance from society while also helping innocent people suffering under increasing discrimination and injustice. Meanwhile, the political atmosphere surrounding talking animals becomes even darker as respected animal professors mysteriously disappear and fear slowly spreads across Oz. Emotionally, Elphaba becomes increasingly disturbed because she strongly relates to anyone judged or mistreated simply for being different from the majority around them. Meanwhile, many students and citizens ignore these injustices because remaining silent feels safer than challenging powerful leaders controlling society. Emotionally, this deeply frustrates Elphaba because she begins understanding how fear allows cruelty and discrimination to grow stronger whenever ordinary people refuse confronting injustice directly. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly becomes more emotionally aware of these problems due to her growing friendship with Elphaba, because before meeting her she rarely questioned society or noticed the emotional suffering hidden beneath Oz's glamorous appearance. Visually, the movie uses emotional conversations, musical performances, awkward social encounters, quiet emotional moments, and humorous dormitory scenes to show how both girls gradually influence and emotionally transform each other despite their differences. Meanwhile, Glinda begins helping Elphaba socially by encouraging her to feel more confident and accepted around other students. Emotionally, these efforts become meaningful because for perhaps the first time in her life, Elphaba experiences genuine friendship from someone who once openly judged and misunderstood her. Meanwhile, Elphaba also helps Glinda emotionally mature by challenging her superficial worldview and encouraging her to think beyond popularity, beauty, fashion, and social approval. Emotionally, Glinda slowly realizes that emotional honesty and compassion matter far more than maintaining a perfect public image admired by society. Meanwhile, Prince Fiyero becomes increasingly fascinated by Elphaba because unlike most people around him, she speaks honestly, questions unfair systems, and refuses pretending everything inside Oz is perfect while innocent people continue suffering. Visually, their growing emotional connection is shown through meaningful conversations, emotional eye contact, romantic musical tension, quiet moments together, and emotionally vulnerable interactions that create complicated feelings between Elphaba, Glinda, and Fiyero. Meanwhile, Glinda still believes her glamorous personality and social status naturally make her the ideal romantic partner for Fiyero, even as she slowly notices his deeper emotional interest in Elphaba's intelligence, honesty, and emotional strength. Emotionally, this creates subtle jealousy and insecurity inside Glinda because she begins fearing that popularity and beauty alone may not guarantee genuine emotional connection or lasting love. Meanwhile, Elphaba struggles emotionally because although she feels attracted to Fiyero, she fears allowing herself emotional happiness after spending most of her life believing nobody could truly love or accept her. Visually, the movie balances emotional drama with fantasy comedy through playful musical numbers, romantic misunderstandings, magical classroom chaos, humorous student interactions, emotional rooftop conversations, and spectacular fantasy visuals that continue building the magical world of Oz while emotionally deepening the relationships between the main characters. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible secretly arranges an opportunity for Elphaba to eventually travel to Emerald City and meet the wizard personally after becoming convinced her extraordinary powers could serve important political purposes within Oz. Emotionally, Elphaba becomes overwhelmed with excitement because she believes meeting the wizard may finally change her life forever by giving her acceptance, purpose, and perhaps even the chance to create a fairer society where people and animals are no longer judged for being different. However, darker political manipulation quietly continues growing around her as powerful leaders inside Oz begin preparing to use fear, propaganda, and emotional division to maintain control over society. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, discrimination, political tension, magical mystery, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how loneliness, prejudice, insecurity, emotional vulnerability, manipulation, and the desire for acceptance slowly shape the destinies of emotionally misunderstood people living inside a society obsessed with power, beauty, and social conformity. Wicked continues as the emotional bond between Elphaba and Glinda grows stronger despite the many differences that once made them dislike each other. Emotionally, both girls slowly begin understanding the loneliness and insecurity hidden beneath each other's personalities because Elphaba realizes Glinda's cheerful confidence hides fear of rejection while Glinda finally sees the emotional pain caused by the constant prejudice and judgment Elphaba experiences every day due to her green skin. Visually, Shiz University continues glowing with colorful fantasy beauty through giant magical towers, sparkling decorations, glowing classrooms, elegant costumes, fantasy gardens, floating magical objects, and energetic musical performances that maintain the magical atmosphere of Oz while darker political tension quietly spreads throughout society. Meanwhile, Elphaba becomes increasingly emotionally invested in protecting the talking animals being discriminated against by powerful leaders controlling Oz because she deeply relates to anyone treated unfairly simply for being different. Emotionally, her anger toward injustice grows stronger after witnessing respected animal teachers lose their positions and disappear while ordinary citizens remain silent out of fear or convenience. Meanwhile, many people inside Oz begin accepting propaganda that portrays talking animals as dangerous or inferior, which emotionally disturbs Elphaba because she recognizes how easily fear can manipulate society into supporting cruelty and discrimination. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly becomes more emotionally aware of these injustices because spending time with Elphaba forces her to notice suffering she once ignored while focusing only on popularity, romance, fashion, and social status. Emotionally, this transformation becomes important because Glinda begins questioning whether society's standards of beauty, success, and goodness are actually fair or truthful. Visually, the movie uses emotional conversations, humorous dormitory scenes, musical performances, romantic tension, awkward social encounters, and fantasy comedy to continue developing the complicated emotional relationship between the two girls while deepening the political conflict spreading across Oz. Meanwhile, Prince Fiyero grows even closer to Elphaba because he admires her emotional honesty, intelligence, compassion, and courage to challenge unfair systems while everyone else avoids difficult truths. Emotionally, Elphaba struggles with these growing romantic feelings because years of rejection convinced her nobody could genuinely love or emotionally accept her. Meanwhile, Glinda notices the emotional connection forming between Fiyero and Elphaba, which quietly creates insecurity and jealousy inside her despite her continued attempts to maintain a glamorous and cheerful public image. Visually, the emotional triangle between the three characters becomes more complicated through meaningful eye contact, emotional musical numbers, romantic tension, playful misunderstandings, emotional vulnerability, and quiet moments where hidden feelings become increasingly difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues mentoring Elphaba while secretly manipulating her emotional hopes and ambitions because she recognizes the enormous political value of Elphaba's extraordinary magical powers. Emotionally, Elphaba remains excited about the possibility of meeting the wizard in Emerald City because she believes he may help her create positive change throughout Oz while finally giving her the acceptance and purpose she desperately wants. Meanwhile, Glinda also becomes excited by the glamorous idea of visiting Emerald City because she imagines fame, elegance, luxury, magical excitement, and social admiration waiting inside the famous capital of Oz. Visually, preparations for the journey toward Emerald City become filled with grand fantasy visuals including magical transportation, glowing city imagery, colorful costumes, musical excitement, and elaborate world building that expands the magical scale of the story. Meanwhile, emotionally, Elphaba's growing hopes begin making her vulnerable because she still believes powerful leaders genuinely want to help improve society rather than manipulate fear and discrimination for political control. However, darker truths slowly begin revealing themselves beneath the beauty and glamour surrounding Oz as political propaganda against talking animals becomes increasingly aggressive and emotionally disturbing. Meanwhile, Elphaba realizes that remaining silent about injustice may eventually make her responsible for allowing cruelty to continue spreading across society. Emotionally, this growing conflict begins shaping the path that will eventually transform her into the misunderstood figure history later calls the Wicked Witch of the West. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, romance, friendship, discrimination, political manipulation, magical mystery, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, prejudice, insecurity, emotional loneliness, propaganda, ambition, and the desire for acceptance slowly influence the destinies of emotionally vulnerable people living inside a society obsessed with beauty, conformity, and power. Wicked continues as Elphaba and Glinda finally travel toward the magnificent Emerald City, Emotionally, both girls feel excited yet emotionally uncertain because the journey represents a major turning point in their lives and future destinies. Visually, the trip becomes one of the most spectacular fantasy sequences in the movie, filled with glowing magical transportation, giant fantasy landscapes, sparkling lights, colorful skies, elaborate costumes, musical performances, magical creatures, and enormous world building that expands the beauty and scale of Oz far beyond the university. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes overwhelmed with excitement because Emerald City represents everything she admires, including glamour, elegance, fame, beauty, popularity, and magical luxury. Emotionally, she dreams about becoming admired within the city while standing beside powerful leaders and important figures inside Oz society. Meanwhile, Elphaba views the journey differently because although she also feels hopeful, her excitement is deeply connected to the possibility of finally helping innocent people suffering from discrimination and political injustice throughout Oz. Emotionally, she believes meeting the wizard may allow her to use her extraordinary magical abilities for meaningful change while finally receiving acceptance from society after a lifetime of emotional rejection and loneliness. Visually, the first appearance of Emerald City becomes breathtaking through massive glowing towers, green crystal architecture, magical streets, enormous fantasy crowds, floating decorations, elegant costumes, dazzling lights, and energetic musical performances that create a magical dreamlike atmosphere filled with excitement and wonder. Meanwhile, both girls become emotionally overwhelmed by the beauty and energy surrounding them because Emerald City appears like the perfect fantasy world they always imagined from childhood stories and political propaganda. Meanwhile, Glinda fully embraces the glamorous atmosphere by enjoying fashionable attention, elegant social events, luxury, playful humor, and public admiration, while Elphaba remains more emotionally focused on finally meeting the wizard and discussing the growing injustice spreading throughout Oz. Emotionally, their friendship continues strengthening because despite their differences, both girls now genuinely care about each other and emotionally support one another during important moments. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains emotionally connected to Elphaba even while physical distance separates them because his admiration for her honesty, compassion, and courage continues growing stronger. Emotionally, Elphaba secretly misses him yet struggles allowing herself romantic hope because years of rejection taught her to emotionally protect herself from disappointment and heartbreak. Meanwhile, inside Emerald City, the political atmosphere becomes increasingly suspicious beneath the glamorous fantasy appearance because signs of propaganda, manipulation, and fear quietly surround the government controlling Oz. Emotionally, Elphaba notices strange tension hidden beneath the city's beauty while Glinda initially remains distracted by excitement and luxury. Visually, the wizard's palace becomes enormous and intimidating through giant mechanical structures, magical technology, elaborate decorations, glowing green imagery, dramatic lighting, giant fantasy interiors, and theatrical spectacle that emphasizes the wizard's overwhelming influence and power across Oz society. Meanwhile, Elphaba finally meets the wizard after years of dreaming about this moment and emotionally expects wisdom, kindness, justice, and magical greatness from the legendary ruler she admired for so long. However, emotionally, the meeting quickly becomes complicated because beneath the wizard's charming personality and theatrical presentation, Elphaba begins noticing manipulation, dishonesty, and political calculation hidden beneath his public image. Meanwhile, the wizard becomes fascinated by Elphaba's extraordinary magical abilities because he immediately recognizes how politically valuable her power could become within his system of control over Oz. Emotionally, Elphaba initially feels honored by his attention because she still desperately wants acceptance and purpose after years of emotional loneliness and rejection. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes impressed and emotionally excited by the glamorous atmosphere surrounding the wizard because she continues associating political power with admiration, success, and social importance. However, darker truths soon begin revealing themselves when Elphaba discovers evidence showing the wizard and Madame Morrible secretly support propaganda and discrimination against talking animals in order to increase political fear and strengthen government control across Oz. Emotionally, this revelation completely shocks and devastates Elphaba because she realizes the leaders she trusted are intentionally creating injustice and suffering for innocent creatures simply to maintain power and manipulate society. Meanwhile, the wizard attempts convincing Elphaba to join him by using her extraordinary magical powers to support his political agenda. Emotionally, this creates enormous internal conflict because accepting his offer would finally give Elphaba recognition, influence, and acceptance, while rejecting him would mean opposing the most powerful government in Oz. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes emotionally torn because she struggles understanding the full seriousness of the political corruption while also fearing the consequences of challenging powerful leaders controlling society. Visually, the emotional confrontation inside Emerald City becomes intense through dramatic lighting, giant fantasy machinery, emotional close-up shots, theatrical musical performances, magical tension, and emotionally charged conversations where Elphaba must decide between personal acceptance and fighting against injustice. Emotionally, Elphaba finally realizes that remaining silent would make her responsible for the cruelty spreading throughout Oz and that true goodness sometimes requires sacrificing popularity, comfort, safety, and emotional acceptance in order to protect innocent lives. Meanwhile, this emotional decision slowly begins transforming her public image from misunderstood outsider into the dangerous enemy society will eventually fear as the Wicked Witch. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, discrimination, political manipulation, magical mystery, emotional conflict, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, insecurity, ambition, and the desire for acceptance can emotionally shape the destinies of vulnerable people living inside a society controlled by power and manipulation. Wicked continues as Elphaba's entire understanding of Oz completely changes after discovering the horrifying political corruption hidden beneath the glamorous image of Emerald City. Emotionally, she feels shocked, betrayed, angry, and deeply heartbroken because the wizard and Madame Morrible were the very people she trusted and admired while secretly supporting cruelty, propaganda, and discrimination against innocent talking animals in order to strengthen their control over society. Visually, the magical beauty of Emerald City now feels darker and more intimidating through dramatic green lighting, giant mechanical structures, enormous palace interiors, shadow-filled hallways, glowing propaganda imagery, and emotionally tense cinematography that reflects Elphaba's growing realization that the government of Oz is built on fear and manipulation rather than justice and kindness. Meanwhile, the wizard continues attempting to emotionally manipulate Elphaba by praising her extraordinary magical abilities and promising her recognition, influence, admiration, and acceptance if she agrees to support his political system. Emotionally, this temptation becomes extremely painful because throughout her entire life Elphaba only wanted acceptance and a chance to belong somewhere without judgment or rejection. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible pressures her emotionally by insisting powerful leaders sometimes must make difficult sacrifices for the stability of society. However, Elphaba realizes innocent creatures are suffering simply because the government wants someone to blame and fear in order to maintain political control across Oz. Emotionally, this realization completely destroys her remaining trust in the system she once admired. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes emotionally overwhelmed because she never imagined the glamorous leaders of Oz could secretly support such cruelty and political deception. Emotionally, she struggles between loyalty toward Elphaba and fear of losing the comfortable, admired life she always dreamed about inside society. Visually, the emotional conflict between the girls becomes intense through emotional close-up shots, dramatic lighting, theatrical tension, magical effects, and emotionally charged conversations where both must decide what kind of people they truly want to become. Meanwhile, Elphaba refuses the wizard's offer despite knowing rejection will immediately transform her into a dangerous enemy of the state because she can no longer ignore injustice simply to gain personal happiness or acceptance. Emotionally, this decision becomes one of the most important moments in her life because for the first time she fully chooses morality and compassion over emotional safety. Meanwhile, the wizard and Madame Morrible instantly begin portraying Elphaba as dangerous and unstable after realizing they cannot control her extraordinary powers. Emotionally, Elphaba feels devastated because she understands society will quickly believe whatever propaganda powerful leaders create against her due to the fear and prejudice already surrounding her appearance and abilities. Visually, the atmosphere inside the palace becomes chaotic and emotionally explosive through magical energy, dramatic musical performances, giant fantasy machinery, emotional confrontation, and powerful visual effects as Elphaba desperately attempts escaping the government forces now trying to capture her. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes emotionally torn because although she knows Elphaba is morally right, she fears opposing the government and losing everything society ever taught her to value, including popularity, security, admiration, and social acceptance. Emotionally, this conflict creates painful tension between the two girls because despite their deep friendship, they now stand on opposite sides of a dangerous political battle spreading across Oz. Meanwhile, Elphaba uses her growing magical abilities to escape Emerald City while government officials immediately begin spreading propaganda describing her as an evil and dangerous witch threatening the safety of society. Emotionally, Elphaba feels completely isolated because the world once again views her as frightening and monstrous despite her genuine desire to protect innocent people from cruelty and injustice. Meanwhile, Glinda remains inside Emerald City emotionally devastated and confused because she still cares deeply about Elphaba yet feels trapped between friendship and fear of society's judgment. Visually, the movie becomes increasingly darker and more emotionally dramatic through stormy skies, giant fantasy landscapes, magical tension, emotional musical performances, glowing green imagery, and political propaganda spreading across Oz as Elphaba's public image slowly transforms into the feared Wicked Witch of the West. Meanwhile, talking animals continue losing rights and freedom while ordinary citizens become increasingly manipulated by fear and misinformation created by the government. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that fighting injustice may cost her every chance of emotional acceptance, friendship, romance, safety, and happiness she ever wanted. However, she also understands remaining silent would destroy her conscience and allow cruelty to continue spreading across Oz unchecked. Meanwhile, Fiyero begins questioning the political system more seriously after hearing disturbing rumors about Elphaba and witnessing increasing government propaganda designed to turn society against her. Emotionally, he struggles because he knows the compassionate and intelligent woman behind the frightening public image while the rest of Oz increasingly sees only a dangerous enemy created by fear and manipulation. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional conflict, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how propaganda, prejudice, fear, insecurity, loneliness, power, and the desire for acceptance can emotionally transform misunderstood people into figures society labels as villains even when they are fighting for justice and compassion. Wicked continues as Elphaba officially becomes the most feared and hunted person throughout Oz after escaping Emerald City and openly rejecting the wizard's corrupt political system. Emotionally, she feels devastated and emotionally exhausted because despite trying to protect innocent talking animals and expose injustice, she is now being portrayed across the kingdom as a dangerous enemy responsible for threatening peace and stability. Visually, propaganda spreads throughout Oz through giant public announcements, magical posters, dramatic speeches, glowing green imagery, frightened crowds, and government-controlled messages designed to manipulate ordinary citizens into fearing Elphaba without understanding the truth behind her actions. Meanwhile, the wizard and Madame Morrible continue strengthening their political control by using fear and emotional division to unite society against a common enemy. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes how easily powerful leaders can manipulate public opinion when people choose comfort and security over questioning injustice and corruption. Meanwhile, Glinda remains emotionally trapped inside Emerald City because although she knows Elphaba is not evil, she struggles with the terrifying consequences of opposing the government and losing the admired life society always promised her. Emotionally, she feels guilt, confusion, fear, and heartbreak because her closest friendship is slowly being destroyed by political conflict and emotional misunderstanding. Visually, Glinda's glamorous world now feels emotionally emptier despite the beauty, Luxury, sparkling costumes, magical performances, and admiration still surrounding her because she increasingly realizes popularity and social acceptance cannot replace genuine emotional honesty and friendship. Meanwhile, Elphaba hides across isolated parts of Oz while continuing to secretly help talking animals escape persecution and discrimination created by the government. Emotionally, she becomes increasingly lonely because nearly everyone now fears or hates her due to the propaganda spreading throughout society. However, despite her emotional pain, she refuses abandoning innocent creatures suffering because of the wizard's political manipulation. Visually, Elphaba's journey becomes darker and more emotional through stormy landscapes. Isolated forests, abandoned castles, magical storms, emotional musical performances, dramatic lighting, and fantasy imagery that reflects her growing transformation into the legendary figure feared across Oz. Meanwhile, Fiyero becomes increasingly disturbed by the government's treatment of Elphaba because he knows the compassionate and intelligent woman behind the terrifying public image being spread throughout society. Emotionally, his feelings for her continue growing stronger as he realizes she sacrificed her own happiness, safety, and acceptance simply to fight against injustice and protect innocent lives. Meanwhile, Glinda also begins emotionally suffering under the pressure of maintaining her perfect public image while secretly knowing the government is lying about Elphaba. Emotionally, she feels trapped between social expectations and her conscience because speaking the truth could destroy everything she spent her life trying to achieve. Visually, the emotional divide between Glinda and Elphaba becomes heartbreaking through parallel scenes showing one living surrounded by luxury, admiration, and public attention while emotionally miserable and conflicted, while the other lives isolated and feared yet emotionally determined to continue fighting for justice despite losing almost everything. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible uses increasingly aggressive magical propaganda to turn society completely against Elphaba by presenting her as unstable, dangerous, and responsible for chaos spreading across Oz. Emotionally, these lies deeply wound Elphaba because throughout her life she only wanted acceptance and understanding, yet now the entire kingdom views her as a monster. However, emotionally she slowly begins accepting that doing the morally right thing sometimes requires enduring loneliness, hatred, and emotional sacrifice. Meanwhile, Fiyero eventually chooses following his conscience rather than blindly supporting the corrupt government because he can no longer ignore the injustice happening around him. Emotionally, this decision changes his relationship with Glinda because although he still cares about her, he realizes his emotional connection with Elphaba is based on deeper understanding, honesty, compassion, and shared values rather than popularity or appearance. Visually, the growing emotional tension between the three characters becomes increasingly dramatic through emotional confrontations, meaningful eye contact, romantic musical performances, emotional vulnerability, and painful conversations filled with regret, love, confusion, and emotional conflict. Meanwhile, the citizens of Oz become increasingly fearful as government propaganda convinces them that Elphaba's growing magical power threatens the safety of the kingdom. Emotionally, this fear allows political leaders to tighten their control while distracting society from the real corruption and discrimination spreading beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Elphaba slowly realizes that no matter how hard she fights, the world may never truly understand her intentions because people often prefer comforting lies over painful truths. Emotionally, this realization becomes heartbreaking because despite being labeled wicked, she continues risking everything simply to protect innocent lives and resist injustice. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, insecurity, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can transform misunderstood people into feared legends despite their genuine compassion and moral courage. Wicked continues as Elphaba officially becomes the most feared and hunted person throughout Oz after escaping Emerald City and openly rejecting the wizard's corrupt political system. Emotionally she feels devastated and emotionally exhausted because despite trying to protect innocent talking animals and expose injustice, she is now being portrayed across the kingdom as a dangerous enemy responsible for threatening peace and stability. Visually, propaganda spreads throughout Oz through giant public announcements, magical posters, dramatic speeches, glowing green imagery, frightened crowds, and government-controlled messages designed to manipulate ordinary citizens into fearing Elphaba without understanding the truth behind her actions. Meanwhile, the wizard and Madame Morrible continue strengthening their political control by using fear and emotional division to unite society against a common enemy. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes how easily powerful leaders can manipulate public opinion when people choose comfort and security over questioning injustice and corruption. Meanwhile, Glinda remains emotionally trapped inside Emerald City because although she knows Elphaba is not evil, she struggles with the terrifying consequences of opposing the government and losing the admired life society always promised her. Emotionally, she feels guilt, confusion, fear, and heartbreak because her closest friendship is slowly being destroyed by political conflict and emotional misunderstanding. Visually, Glinda's glamorous world now feels emotionally emptier despite the beauty, luxury, sparkling costumes, magical performances, and admiration still surrounding her because she increasingly realizes popularity and social acceptance cannot replace genuine emotional honesty and friendship. Meanwhile, Elphaba hides across isolated parts of Oz while continuing to secretly help talking animals escape persecution and discrimination created by the government. Emotionally, she becomes increasingly lonely because nearly everyone now fears or hates her due to the propaganda spreading throughout society. However, despite her emotional pain, she refuses abandoning innocent creatures suffering because of the wizard's political manipulation. Visually, Elphaba's journey becomes darker and more emotional through stormy landscapes, isolated forests, abandoned castles, magical storms, emotional musical performances, dramatic lighting, and fantasy imagery that reflects her growing transformation into the legendary figure feared across Oz. Meanwhile, Fiyero becomes increasingly disturbed by the government's treatment of Elphaba because he knows the compassionate and intelligent woman behind the terrifying public image being spread throughout society. Emotionally, his feelings for her continue growing stronger as he realizes she sacrificed her own happiness, safety, and acceptance simply to fight against injustice and protect innocent lives. Meanwhile, Glinda also begins emotionally suffering under the pressure of maintaining her perfect public image while secretly knowing the government is lying about Elphaba. Emotionally, she feels trapped between social expectations and her conscience because speaking the truth could destroy everything she spent her life trying to achieve. Visually, the emotional divide between Glinda and Elphaba becomes heartbreaking through parallel scenes showing one living surrounded by luxury, admiration, and public attention while emotionally miserable and conflicted, while the other lives isolated and feared yet emotionally determined to continue fighting for justice despite losing almost everything. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible uses increasingly aggressive magical propaganda to turn society completely against Elphaba by presenting her as unstable, dangerous, and responsible for chaos spreading across Oz. Emotionally, these lies deeply wound Elphaba because throughout her life she only wanted acceptance and understanding, yet now the entire kingdom views her as a monster. However, emotionally she slowly begins accepting that doing the morally right thing sometimes requires enduring loneliness, hatred, and emotional sacrifice. Meanwhile, Fiyero eventually chooses following his conscience rather than blindly supporting the corrupt government because he can no longer ignore the injustice happening around him. Emotionally, this decision changes his relationship with Glinda because although he still cares about her, he realizes his emotional connection with Elphaba is based on deeper understanding, honesty, compassion, and shared values rather than popularity or appearance. Visually, the growing emotional tension between the three characters becomes increasingly dramatic through emotional confrontations, meaningful eye contact, romantic musical performances, emotional vulnerability, and painful conversations filled with regret, love, confusion, and emotional conflict. Meanwhile, the citizens of Oz become increasingly fearful as government propaganda convinces them that Elphaba's growing magical power threatens the safety of the kingdom. Emotionally, this fear allows political leaders to tighten their control while distracting society from the real corruption and discrimination spreading beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Elphaba slowly realizes that no matter how hard she fights, the world may never truly understand her intentions because people often prefer comforting lies over painful truths. Emotionally, this realization becomes heartbreaking because despite being labeled wicked, she continues risking everything simply to protect innocent lives and resist injustice. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, insecurity, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can transform misunderstood people into feared legends despite their genuine compassion and moral courage. Wicked continues as Elphaba's reputation across Oz becomes increasingly terrifying due to the endless propaganda spread by the wizard and Madame Morrible. Emotionally, ordinary citizens now genuinely believe she is a dangerous witch threatening the peace of the kingdom, even though most of them have never actually met her or witnessed her true intentions. Visually, Oz becomes filled with fear-driven imagery including magical warning posters, frightened crowds, dramatic public speeches, glowing green propaganda, military patrols, and emotionally tense environments showing how deeply society has been manipulated into fearing someone simply because she challenged powerful leaders and looked different from everyone else. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues hiding in isolated locations while secretly helping talking animals escape persecution and imprisonment created by the government. Emotionally, she feels increasingly lonely and emotionally exhausted because every act of kindness she performs is twisted into something evil by the authorities controlling public opinion. However, despite the emotional pain, she refuses abandoning innocent creatures suffering because of corruption and discrimination. Visually, her isolated life becomes darker and more emotional through stormy skies, abandoned castles, magical forests, emotional musical performances, dramatic lighting, and fantasy imagery reflecting her growing transformation into the legendary Wicked Witch feared throughout Oz history. Meanwhile, Fiyero's emotional connection with Elphaba becomes impossible for him to ignore because he now fully understands her compassion, intelligence, courage, and emotional vulnerability beneath the frightening public image created by propaganda. Emotionally, he realizes she sacrificed her own safety, happiness, and acceptance simply to protect innocent lives and oppose injustice while everyone else remained silent out of fear or selfishness. Meanwhile, Glinda continues emotionally struggling inside Emerald City because although she now clearly recognizes the government's corruption, she still fears losing the admiration, status, comfort, and security society always taught her to value. Emotionally, this internal conflict deeply hurts her because she still loves Elphaba as a friend yet feels trapped inside a political system that rewards obedience and punishes honesty. Visually, Glinda's glamorous world begins feeling emotionally empty despite the sparkling costumes, luxurious events, magical performances, and public admiration surrounding her because she increasingly understands that popularity cannot replace emotional truth, genuine friendship, or moral courage. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible intensifies her campaign against Elphaba by using magical weather disasters and emotional propaganda to further convince citizens that the Wicked Witch is responsible for every problem spreading across Oz. Emotionally, Elphaba becomes heartbroken watching innocent people fear and hate her despite her attempts to help them because throughout her entire life she only wanted understanding and acceptance rather than power or destruction. However, emotionally, she slowly begins accepting that history is often controlled by powerful people who decide which stories society believes and which truths become buried beneath fear and lies. Meanwhile, Fiyero eventually risks everything by secretly helping Elphaba avoid capture after realizing the government intends destroying her completely rather than seeking justice or truth. Emotionally, this decision marks a major turning point in his life because he finally chooses love, conscience, and moral integrity over social status. comfort, and political obedience. Meanwhile, Glinda notices Fiero's emotional loyalty toward Elphaba and feels devastated because she understands his connection with Elphaba is based on genuine emotional understanding rather than superficial attraction or popularity. Emotionally, this creates painful heartbreak for Glinda because despite all her beauty, charm, and social success, she cannot compete with the emotional honesty and deep connection shared between Elphaba and Fiero. Visually, the emotional triangle between the three characters becomes increasingly tragic through emotional confrontations, heartbreaking conversations, romantic tension, emotional musical numbers, tearful vulnerability, and dramatic fantasy visuals emphasizing how political conflict and fear are destroying relationships that once brought happiness and emotional connection into their lives. Meanwhile, the citizens of Oz become even more fearful as government propaganda convinces them Elphaba's growing magical abilities could destroy the kingdom entirely if she is not stopped immediately. Emotionally, this fear allows the wizard and Madame Morrible to gain even more control because frightened societies often surrender freedom and compassion whenever powerful leaders promise safety and stability. Meanwhile, Elphaba realizes she may never again experience normal happiness, friendship, love, or emotional acceptance because society now permanently views her as a monster regardless of her true intentions. Emotionally, this realization deeply wounds her yet also strengthens her determination to continue fighting against injustice even if history forever misunderstands her sacrifices. Visually, the movie becomes increasingly emotional and dramatic through giant magical storms, glowing green skies, emotional close-up shots, isolated fantasy landscapes, theatrical musical performances, and dark fantasy imagery reflecting Elphaba's painful transformation from lonely misunderstood student into the feared legend known across Oz as the Wicked Witch of the West. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly begins questioning whether remaining silent and socially accepted is morally worse than becoming hated for speaking the truth because watching Elphaba suffer forces her to confront the emotional cost of fear, obedience, and political cowardice. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, insecurity, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can destroy innocent lives and transform compassionate people into villains within the story's history chooses to remember. Wicked continues as the political conflict spreading across Oz becomes increasingly dangerous while Elphaba's emotional isolation grows deeper than ever before. Emotionally, she now fully understands that the government will never stop hunting her because the wizard and Madame Morrible need society to fear someone in order to maintain political control and distract citizens from the corruption, discrimination, and cruelty spreading beneath the glamorous image of Emerald City. Visually, Oz becomes darker and more emotionally tense through storm-filled skies, glowing green propaganda, frightened crowds, giant magical announcements, military patrols, abandoned landscapes, and dramatic fantasy imagery showing how fear has slowly consumed the kingdom. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues secretly helping talking animals escape persecution despite knowing every act of kindness increases the government's determination to capture and destroy her. Emotionally, she feels exhausted, lonely, heartbroken, and emotionally misunderstood because throughout her entire life she only wanted acceptance, friendship, and the chance to make the world fairer, yet society now sees her as the greatest threat to peace and stability. However, despite her emotional pain, she refuses abandoning innocent creatures suffering because of injustice and political manipulation. Meanwhile, Fiero openly distances himself from the government after secretly helping Elphaba escape capture. Emotionally, this decision completely changes his life because he sacrifices social privilege, political safety, and his future reputation in order to protect the woman he genuinely loves and emotionally understands. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes increasingly emotionally conflicted because although society continues celebrating her as a beautiful symbol of goodness and elegance, she privately knows the government's version of events is built on lies and fear. Emotionally, she begins realizing that popularity and admiration mean very little when achieved through silence and emotional cowardice while innocent people continue suffering around her. Visually, Glinda's glamorous life inside Emerald City feels increasingly hollow despite luxurious costumes, sparkling magical performances, grand public celebrations, and endless social attention because emotionally she now feels trapped between her conscience and the expectations society placed upon her since childhood. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible intensifies propaganda against Elphaba by using magical disasters and public fear to convince citizens that the Wicked Witch grows more dangerous every day. Emotionally, ordinary people become increasingly terrified because they desperately want someone simple to blame for the uncertainty and fear spreading across Oz. Meanwhile, Elphaba slowly realizes society often chooses comforting lies over painful truths because fear feels emotionally easier than confronting corruption and injustice directly. Emotionally, this realization becomes heartbreaking because no matter how compassionately she acts, the world continues viewing her through the frightening image created by political propaganda. Meanwhile, Fiyero secretly reunites with Elphaba and emotionally confesses how deeply he cares about her because unlike everyone else, she refuses pretending injustice does not exist simply to remain comfortable or socially admired. Emotionally, Elphaba struggles accepting his love because years of rejection and emotional isolation taught her believing in happiness only leads to eventual heartbreak and disappointment. However, Fiyero reassures her that her compassion, honesty, courage, and emotional strength make her more beautiful and admirable than anyone else inside Oz, regardless of how society views her appearance or magical power. Visually, their emotional reunion becomes deeply romantic and emotionally vulnerable through stormy fantasy landscapes. Emotional close-up shots, meaningful eye contact, romantic musical performances, glowing magical imagery, and quiet conversations filled with emotional honesty and longing. Meanwhile, Glinda eventually realizes that although she still cares deeply for Fiyero, she cannot compete with the emotional connection he shares with Elphaba because their relationship is built on genuine understanding rather than superficial attraction or social expectations. Emotionally, this realization devastates Glinda because for the first time she understands that beauty, popularity, and admiration cannot guarantee love or emotional fulfillment. Meanwhile, the government's forces eventually discover Fiyero helped Elphaba escape, which immediately transforms him into a political target as well. Emotionally, Elphaba becomes terrified because everyone close to her eventually suffers due to society's fear and hatred toward her. Meanwhile, Fiyero refuses abandoning her despite the danger because he believes protecting innocent people and fighting injustice matters more than comfort, privilege, or social acceptance. Visually, the emotional tension becomes increasingly dramatic through magical chases, giant fantasy environments, emotional confrontations, glowing storms, theatrical musical performances, and heartbreaking moments where love, friendship, and morality collide against political fear and manipulation. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly begins recognizing how deeply the wizard and Madame Morrible emotionally manipulated both her and the citizens of Oz by exploiting insecurity, prejudice, and fear in order to maintain control. Emotionally, she feels guilt for remaining silent so long while Elphaba sacrificed everything simply for telling the truth and protecting vulnerable lives. However, Glinda still fears openly challenging the government because she understands society may eventually hate and reject her just as cruelly as it rejected Elphaba. Meanwhile, Elphaba realizes her destiny may now permanently involve loneliness and emotional sacrifice because even if she continues fighting for justice, history may only remember her as the terrifying Wicked Witch feared throughout Oz. Emotionally, this possibility deeply saddens her because she once dreamed about acceptance and love rather than becoming a symbol of fear. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, insecurity, loneliness, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can transform compassionate people into misunderstood villains within the stories history chooses to believe. Wicked continues as the emotional and political conflict across Oz reaches an even more tragic and dangerous stage. Emotionally, Elphaba now lives completely separated from ordinary society because nearly the entire kingdom fears her after months of propaganda spread by the wizard and Madame Morrible. Visually, Oz becomes increasingly dark and emotionally unstable through giant magical storms, glowing green skies, frightened crowds, military patrols, public warning announcements, dramatic fantasy landscapes, and emotionally tense cinematography that reflects how fear and manipulation have slowly consumed the once colorful kingdom. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues using her extraordinary magical abilities to secretly protect talking animals and innocent people suffering under the government's discrimination despite knowing every action increases the danger surrounding her life. Emotionally, she feels exhausted and heartbroken because every attempt to help others is twisted into proof of her supposed wickedness by the authorities controlling public opinion. However, despite the loneliness and emotional suffering, she refuses abandoning her moral beliefs because she knows remaining silent would allow cruelty and corruption to spread even further across Oz. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains devoted to Elphaba despite becoming a wanted man himself after openly opposing the government and helping her escape capture. Emotionally, his relationship with Elphaba grows even deeper because he now fully understands the pain, fear, rejection, and emotional isolation she endured throughout her life simply for being different and refusing to obey injustice. Meanwhile, Elphaba struggles emotionally because she fears everyone who loves or supports her eventually suffers due to the hatred society directs toward her. However, Fiyero reassures her that choosing truth and compassion is more important than protecting social status or political comfort. Visually, their relationship becomes increasingly emotional and romantic through stormy fantasy settings. Quiet emotional conversations, meaningful eye contact, emotional musical performances, magical landscapes, and intimate scenes filled with honesty, vulnerability, and emotional longing. Meanwhile, Glinda continues living inside Emerald City surrounded by admiration, luxury, beauty, and political influence, yet emotionally she feels increasingly empty and conflicted because she now understands the entire system supporting her glamorous life is built on lies, fear, propaganda, and emotional manipulation. Emotionally, she struggles with guilt because Elphaba sacrificed everything to protect innocent lives while she remained silent in order to preserve popularity and social acceptance. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues intensifying public fear by blaming Elphaba for magical disasters, political instability, and growing unrest spreading across Oz. Emotionally, ordinary citizens become more terrified every day because the government constantly convinces them the wicked witch threatens the safety of their families and future. Meanwhile, the wizard uses Elphaba's frightening public image to strengthen his authority because frightened societies become easier to control whenever they unite against a common enemy. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that powerful leaders often create villains to distract society from deeper injustice and corruption hidden beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Glinda eventually confronts the emotional reality that remaining silent about the truth makes her partly responsible for the suffering spreading throughout Oz. Emotionally, this realization deeply changes her because for the first time she begins valuing honesty and morality more than popularity, beauty, and social admiration. However, openly supporting Elphaba would mean losing everything society taught her to value, including safety, status, privilege, and public love. Visually, Glinda's emotional conflict becomes increasingly heartbreaking through lonely palace scenes, emotional close-up shots, glamorous environments hiding emotional sadness, and painful conversations where she struggles deciding whether courage matters more than comfort and acceptance. Meanwhile, the government's forces finally capture Fiyero after discovering his continued loyalty toward Elphaba. Emotionally, this moment completely devastates Elphaba because she fears the people she loves always become victims of society's hatred toward her. Meanwhile, the authorities cruelly punish Fiyero in order to emotionally break Elphaba and force her surrender. Visually, these scenes become emotionally intense through dramatic lighting, magical violence, storm-filled fantasy imagery, emotional screams, powerful musical performances, and heartbreaking emotional reactions showing Elphaba's growing desperation and rage. Meanwhile, Elphaba's magical powers become increasingly uncontrollable due to overwhelming grief, anger, fear, and emotional pain caused by Fiyero's suffering. emotionally she begins feeling trapped between compassion and destructive rage because years of rejection, propaganda, loneliness, and emotional loss are finally pushing her toward emotional collapse. However, beneath the anger she still desperately wants justice, truth, and protection for innocent lives rather than revenge or destruction. Meanwhile, Glinda realizes the government is willing to destroy innocent people simply to preserve political control and maintain the frightening myths surrounding the Wicked Witch. Emotionally, this completely destroys her remaining faith in the wizard and Madame Morrible because she now understands how deeply fear and propaganda corrupted the entire kingdom. Visually, the emotional atmosphere of the movie becomes increasingly tragic and dramatic through giant magical storms, emotional confrontations, glowing green imagery, heartbreaking musical performances, dramatic fantasy environments, and emotional cinematography reflecting how friendship, love, morality, and truth are slowly being destroyed by fear, manipulation, and political ambition. Meanwhile, Elphaba begins emotionally accepting that history may never remember her kindness, sacrifices, or compassion because society already decided viewing her as a monster feels easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth behind Oz's corruption. Emotionally, this realization becomes one of the most painful moments of her life because she once dreamed about acceptance and belonging yet now expects only fear and hatred from the world around her. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, insecurity, emotional manipulation, ambition, and society's obsession with appearances can destroy innocent lives and transform compassionate people into the villains history chooses to fear. Wicked continues as Elphaba's emotional world begins collapsing under the weight of grief, betrayal, loneliness, and the terrifying realization that the entire kingdom now sees her as the embodiment of evil. Emotionally, she feels shattered after witnessing the government brutally punish Fiyero for helping her because she knows his suffering happened only because he chose love, honesty, and moral courage over obedience to the corrupt political system controlling Oz. Visually, the atmosphere becomes darker and more emotionally intense through violent magical storms, glowing green skies, ruined fantasy landscapes, dramatic lighting, emotional close-up shots, and haunting musical performances reflecting Elphaba's growing despair and emotional instability. Meanwhile, rumors spread across Oz that the Wicked Witch has become more dangerous than ever after losing emotional control due to overwhelming pain and anger. Emotionally, ordinary citizens become increasingly terrified because the wizard and Madame Morrible continue using propaganda to present every magical disturbance as proof that Elphaba threatens the future of the kingdom. Meanwhile, the government strengthens its political power by convincing frightened citizens that only strict control and obedience can protect society from chaos and destruction. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that fear has completely replaced truth within Oz because people now blindly accept comforting lies rather than questioning the cruelty happening around them. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes emotionally devastated after learning the full extent of the government's cruelty toward Fiyero and Elphaba because she finally understands how silence and political obedience allowed innocent people to suffer while powerful leaders manipulated society for their own benefit. Emotionally, guilt begins consuming her because although she never directly harmed Elphaba, she failed protecting her closest friend when courage mattered most. Visually, Glinda's glamorous life inside Emerald City now feels emotionally hollow despite luxurious surroundings. Elegant costumes, magical performances, and endless admiration because she can no longer ignore the suffering hidden beneath Oz's beautiful appearance. Meanwhile, Elphaba secretly searches for any way to save Fiyero while struggling to maintain emotional control over her increasingly unstable magical powers. Emotionally, she feels torn between compassion and destructive rage because years of rejection, loneliness, betrayal, fear, and emotional loss are slowly pushing her toward hopelessness. However, despite everything, she still refuses becoming cruel or heartless because protecting innocent lives remains more important to her than revenge against the people who destroyed her happiness. Meanwhile, Fiero's emotional loyalty toward Elphaba never weakens even while facing punishment and danger because he knows the compassionate woman behind the terrifying public image created by propaganda. Emotionally, his love gives Elphaba one of the few remaining reasons to continue fighting despite the overwhelming hatred directed toward her from society. Visually, their emotional connection remains powerful through flashbacks. Emotional memories, romantic musical themes, meaningful dialogue, and heartbreaking fantasy imagery emphasizing how political fear and manipulation destroyed lives that once held genuine happiness and emotional hope. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magical disasters and public fear to strengthen the myth of the Wicked Witch because the government needs society emotionally united against a common enemy in order to maintain control. Emotionally, ordinary citizens become increasingly hostile toward Elphaba because years of propaganda taught them viewing her as evil feels easier than confronting uncomfortable truths about corruption and injustice inside Oz. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly realizes she must eventually choose between continuing to benefit from the corrupt system or finally standing beside the truth regardless of the personal consequences. Emotionally, this decision terrifies her because challenging the government could destroy her popularity, safety, and entire identity within society. However, watching Elphaba lose everything for doing the morally right thing forces Glinda to confront her own emotional cowardice and fear of rejection. Visually, the emotional tension between truth and propaganda becomes increasingly dramatic through giant public gatherings. Emotional speeches, magical announcements, storm-filled fantasy environments, glowing green imagery, and theatrical musical performances reflecting the kingdom's growing instability and fear. Meanwhile, Elphaba eventually learns disturbing truths about how deeply the wizard manipulated Oz by exploiting insecurity, prejudice, fear, and emotional division in order to maintain authority despite lacking genuine magical power himself. Emotionally, this revelation completely changes Elphaba's understanding of the kingdom because she realizes the man controlling Oz built his influence not through wisdom or morality but through deception, spectacle, propaganda, and emotional manipulation. Meanwhile, Glinda begins emotionally reconnecting with the compassion and honesty Elphaba once encouraged within her because she now understands true goodness requires courage, empathy, and moral responsibility rather than beauty, popularity, or social approval. Emotionally, this growth becomes painful yet necessary because she must finally accept that remaining silent about injustice helped create the tragedy consuming Oz. Visually, the movie grows increasingly emotional and tragic through magical chaos, emotional confrontations, heartbreaking musical performances, dramatic fantasy cinematography, isolated landscapes, glowing magical imagery, and deeply emotional scenes showing how fear and political manipulation slowly destroyed friendship, love, innocence, and trust across the kingdom. Meanwhile, Elphaba emotionally accepts that history may never understand her true intentions because society already transformed her into a legendary monster within public imagination. However, despite the loneliness and heartbreak, she still refuses abandoning compassion because protecting innocent people matters more to her than being loved or accepted by the world around her. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, insecurity, loneliness, emotional manipulation, ambition, and society's obsession with appearances can emotionally destroy compassionate people and transform them into villains within the stories history chooses to remember. Wicked continues as Oz falls deeper into fear, emotional division, and political manipulation while Elphaba becomes increasingly isolated from the world she once hoped to protect. Emotionally, she now understands that no matter how much kindness or compassion she shows, society will continue viewing her as the terrifying Wicked Witch because the government's propaganda has completely shaped public perception across the kingdom. Visually, Oz appears darker and more emotionally broken through giant magical storms, frightened crowds, glowing green propaganda, military patrols, abandoned fantasy landscapes, dramatic lighting, and emotionally heavy cinematography reflecting how fear and hatred slowly poisoned the once colorful magical world. Meanwhile, Elphaba secretly continues helping innocent talking animals escape imprisonment and persecution despite the enormous danger surrounding her every movement. Emotionally, she feels exhausted and emotionally shattered because every sacrifice she made for justice only brought more loneliness, heartbreak, and suffering into her life. However, she still refuses abandoning her moral beliefs because protecting vulnerable lives matters more to her than personal happiness or emotional acceptance. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes increasingly haunted by guilt and emotional regret because she realizes Elphaba lost everything simply for speaking the truth while she remained protected by privilege, popularity, and political silence. Emotionally, Glinda struggles accepting how much fear controlled her decisions throughout her life because she now understands that true goodness requires courage rather than public admiration or social approval. Visually, Glinda's glamorous surroundings inside Emerald City feel emotionally lifeless despite elegant costumes, magical performances, luxury, sparkling decorations, and endless attention because emotionally she feels trapped inside a system built on lies and manipulation. Meanwhile, the wizard continues strengthening his authority by presenting himself as Oz's protector against the dangerous wicked witch while secretly hiding the truth about his corruption and lack of genuine magical power. Emotionally, ordinary citizens become even more dependent on fear because believing in a clear villain feels emotionally easier than questioning the government or confronting uncomfortable truths about injustice spreading across society. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible intensifies magical propaganda and weather disasters to keep the kingdom emotionally terrified and politically obedient. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that the people controlling Oz will never willingly allow truth to destroy the false narrative they created around her because their power depends entirely on maintaining fear and emotional division. Meanwhile, Fiero's fate continues emotionally haunting Elphaba because she blames herself for the suffering inflicted upon everyone who ever loved or trusted her. Emotionally, this guilt becomes almost unbearable as she begins believing her existence only brings pain, danger, and destruction into the lives of others. However, deep inside she still desperately longs for love, peace, acceptance, and emotional connection despite convincing herself those dreams may never become possible again. Visually, the movie becomes increasingly tragic and emotional through isolated castles, dark magical forests, emotional close-up shots, storm-filled skies, haunting musical performances, glowing magical imagery, and fantasy environments reflecting Elphaba's growing despair and emotional loneliness. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly begins questioning the entire identity society created around her because she realizes being admired and celebrated means very little when achieved through silence and emotional cowardice while innocent people continue suffering. Emotionally, she feels torn between maintaining the beautiful public image Oz expects from her and finally standing beside the truth regardless of the consequences. Meanwhile, memories of her friendship with Elphaba emotionally overwhelm her because she remembers the lonely, intelligent, emotionally vulnerable girl hidden beneath the terrifying public legend society now fears. Visually, flashbacks and emotional musical themes emphasize how deeply the friendship between Elphaba and Glinda once transformed both their lives before politics, fear, and propaganda destroyed their emotional connection. Meanwhile, Elphaba eventually uncovers even more disturbing truths about the wizard's manipulation of Oz and realizes the entire political system depends upon keeping citizens emotionally distracted through fear, spectacle, and manufactured enemies rather than allowing justice, equality, or compassion to guide society. Emotionally, this revelation strengthens her determination to resist despite understanding the world may never recognize her sacrifices or true intentions. Meanwhile, Glinda finally begins emotionally accepting that avoiding difficult truths only allows corruption and cruelty to become stronger because silence protects the powerful rather than the innocent. Emotionally, this growth becomes painful because it forces her to confront her own fear, vanity, insecurity, and emotional weakness for the first time in her life. Visually, the emotional atmosphere becomes increasingly heartbreaking through dramatic confrontations, emotional speeches, magical chaos, giant fantasy landscapes, glowing green skies, emotional musical performances, and cinematography filled with sorrow, regret, anger, and emotional vulnerability. Meanwhile, Elphaba slowly realizes that history often remembers misunderstood people as monsters simply because powerful leaders controlled the stories society was taught to believe. Emotionally, this understanding deeply saddens her because she once dreamed about belonging and love rather than becoming a symbol of fear hated across an entire kingdom. However, despite losing friendship, safety, romance, and emotional acceptance, she still refuses abandoning compassion because helping innocent lives remains the only thing giving meaning to her suffering. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, insecurity, loneliness, emotional manipulation, ambition, and society's obsession with appearances can destroy truth, compassion, and innocence while transforming emotionally vulnerable people into villains within the stories history chooses to remember. Wicked continues as the emotional tragedy surrounding Elphaba reaches an even more painful stage while Oz becomes completely consumed by fear, propaganda, and political manipulation. Emotionally, Elphaba now lives almost entirely alone because the government successfully convinced the kingdom that the Wicked Witch is responsible for every disaster, fear, and instability spreading across society. Visually, the magical world of Oz feels darker and emotionally broken through giant storms, glowing green skies, abandoned castles, frightened citizens, military patrols, emotional cinematography, dramatic lighting, and haunting fantasy imagery reflecting how deeply hatred and fear corrupted the kingdom. Meanwhile, Elphaba secretly continues protecting talking animals and innocent people suffering beneath the wizard's corrupt rule despite understanding the world will never thank or accept her for these sacrifices. Emotionally, she feels emotionally exhausted, heartbroken, isolated, and overwhelmed by grief because everything she once wanted, including friendship, love, belonging, peace, and emotional acceptance, has been destroyed by society's fear and prejudice. However, even through the pain, she refuses abandoning compassion because helping vulnerable lives remains the only thing that still gives purpose to her suffering. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes increasingly emotionally disturbed by the growing cruelty spreading throughout Oz because she now fully understands the government intentionally manipulated citizens through fear and emotional division in order to maintain political control. Emotionally, guilt continues haunting her because she remembers how Elphaba once trusted her completely before fear and social pressure pulled them apart. Visually, Glinda's glamorous public image now contrasts painfully against her growing emotional sadness through luxurious yet emotionally empty environments filled with sparkling costumes, magical celebrations, giant public events, and endless admiration hiding deep loneliness and regret beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the wizard strengthens his authority further by convincing citizens that defeating the Wicked Witch represents the only way to restore peace and safety across Oz. Emotionally, ordinary people become completely consumed by fear because years of propaganda trained them to believe emotional comfort matters more than truth or justice. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues manipulating weather, magical disasters, and public fear to keep society emotionally dependent on the government while turning Elphaba into a legendary monster within public imagination. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes history is being rewritten around her while she is still alive because powerful people control the stories citizens hear and remember. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly begins emotionally transforming into a stronger and more morally aware person because witnessing Elphaba's suffering forces her to confront painful truths about herself, society, and the consequences of remaining silent in the face of injustice. Emotionally, she starts understanding that true goodness is not about beauty, popularity, admiration, or social status but instead about courage, empathy, sacrifice, and honesty even when those choices lead to fear and rejection. Meanwhile, Elphaba secretly discovers more details about the wizard's deception and finally realizes he possesses no true magical abilities powerful enough to deserve the legendary reputation surrounding him. Emotionally, this revelation completely exposes the illusion controlling Oz because the man ruling the kingdom built his authority entirely through manipulation, spectacle, propaganda, and society's willingness to blindly follow comforting myths rather than difficult truths. Visually, the emotional and political tension becomes increasingly dramatic through giant fantasy landscapes, magical confrontations, storm-filled skies, emotional musical performances, glowing green imagery, and heartbreaking cinematography emphasizing how fear slowly destroyed friendship, trust, innocence, and emotional connection across the kingdom. Meanwhile, memories of happier moments between Elphaba and Glinda continue emotionally haunting both women because despite everything they still care deeply about one another beneath the pain, betrayal, and political conflict separating them. Emotionally, Glinda regrets not standing beside Elphaba sooner, while Elphaba secretly misses the friendship and emotional warmth she once experienced before becoming the feared Wicked Witch. Meanwhile, Fiero's love and loyalty remain one of the few emotional lights inside Elphaba's painful life because he understood the compassionate and emotionally vulnerable woman hidden beneath the terrifying public image created by propaganda. Emotionally, Elphaba struggles believing she deserves love or happiness anymore because years of rejection and suffering convinced her the world only sees her as dangerous and unwanted. However, deep inside she still longs for emotional connection and peace despite expecting only loneliness and fear from the future. Meanwhile, citizens across Oz become increasingly aggressive toward anything associated with the Wicked Witch because fear and propaganda transformed hatred into a form of emotional unity throughout society. Emotionally, this deeply saddens Elphaba because she realizes many innocent people genuinely believe destroying her will somehow heal the kingdom, even though the real corruption exists within the government manipulating them. Visually, the movie grows increasingly tragic and emotionally intense through isolated magical landscapes, giant storms, emotional confrontations, dramatic fantasy imagery, haunting musical performances, and emotional close-up shots showing how deeply fear and manipulation damaged every relationship and dream once shared between the characters. Meanwhile, Glinda finally begins emotionally accepting that remaining silent about injustice only protects corrupt leaders while innocent lives continue suffering. Emotionally, this realization prepares her for the painful choices she will soon have to make between public acceptance and moral truth. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, insecurity, loneliness, emotional manipulation, ambition, and society's obsession with appearances can emotionally destroy truth, compassion, innocence, and love while transforming misunderstood people into villains within the story's history chooses to believe. Wicked continues as the emotional divide between truth and propaganda across Oz becomes almost impossible to repair while Elphaba's loneliness and suffering grow even heavier. Emotionally, she now fully understands that the kingdom no longer sees her as a human being with feelings, compassion, and pain, but instead as a terrifying symbol created by fear, manipulation, and political lies. Visually, Oz becomes increasingly chaotic and emotionally unstable through violent magical storms, glowing green skies, frightened citizens, military patrols, dramatic lighting, abandoned fantasy landscapes, emotional cinematography, and giant public announcements constantly warning society about the dangerous Wicked Witch. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues hiding while secretly helping innocent talking animals and vulnerable citizens escape persecution despite knowing every compassionate act only increases the government's determination to destroy her completely. Emotionally, she feels emotionally drained and heartbroken because no matter how much good she does, the world continues twisting her kindness into evidence of evil. However, she still refuses abandoning compassion because helping innocent lives remains the only thing preventing her from emotionally collapsing under grief, anger, and isolation. Meanwhile, Glinda becomes increasingly unable to tolerate the lies and corruption surrounding the wizard and Madame Morrible because she now fully recognizes how deeply fear has poisoned society and destroyed the lives of people she once loved. Emotionally, guilt and regret consume her as memories of Elphaba's friendship continue haunting her thoughts because she realizes her silence allowed propaganda and cruelty to spread unchecked across Oz. Visually, Glinda's glamorous public life now feels emotionally empty and painful despite luxurious palaces, sparkling costumes, magical celebrations, public admiration, and elegant fantasy imagery because beneath the beauty she feels trapped inside a false identity built on obedience and fear. Meanwhile, the wizard continues manipulating citizens by presenting himself as the heroic protector of Oz while secretly using Elphaba's frightening reputation to distract society from his political corruption and deception. Emotionally ordinary people become increasingly dependent on fear because believing in a clear enemy gives them emotional comfort and stability during uncertain times. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible intensifies magical disasters and emotional propaganda in order to strengthen public hatred toward Elphaba while ensuring the government maintains complete control over the kingdom. Emotionally, Elphaba slowly realizes that fear often matters more to society than truth because frightened people prefer simple villains rather than confronting the complicated realities of injustice and corruption. Meanwhile, Glinda begins emotionally changing into a far stronger and more self-aware person because she finally understands that true goodness requires moral courage and emotional honesty rather than beauty. Popularity, or public approval. Emotionally, this transformation becomes deeply painful because she must confront the emotional cowardice and insecurity that once prevented her from standing beside Elphaba when it mattered most. Meanwhile, Elphaba secretly reunites with Fiyero after believing she might lose him forever due to the government's cruelty. Emotionally, their reunion becomes one of the few moments of hope remaining in her painful life because Fiyero continues loving the compassionate and emotionally vulnerable woman hidden beneath the terrifying public legend society fears. Visually, their emotional connection is portrayed through haunting fantasy landscapes, emotional close-up shots, romantic musical themes, glowing magical imagery, and deeply vulnerable conversations filled with sadness, longing, and emotional honesty. Meanwhile, Elphaba confesses how emotionally exhausted she feels after spending her entire life being judged, rejected, feared, and misunderstood simply for looking different and refusing to obey corruption. Emotionally, Fiyero reassures her that history's version of a person is not always the truth and that her compassion, courage, and sacrifices matter even if society never fully understands them. Meanwhile, Glinda begins secretly questioning how she can continue serving a political system responsible for destroying innocent lives and emotionally manipulating an entire kingdom through lies and fear. Emotionally, she realizes remaining silent any longer would make her directly responsible for the suffering continuing across Oz. Visually, the emotional atmosphere becomes increasingly tragic and dramatic through giant fantasy environments. Magical confrontations, storm-filled skies, emotional speeches, heartbreaking musical performances, glowing green imagery, and emotionally intense cinematography reflecting how fear and propaganda destroyed friendship, love, trust, innocence, and emotional connection throughout the kingdom. Meanwhile, citizens across Oz become more aggressive and emotionally unstable as hatred toward the wicked witch transforms into a form of collective obsession driven entirely by fear and political manipulation. Emotionally, this deeply saddens Elphaba because she understands many ordinary people are victims of deception just as much as she is. However, the emotional pain of being endlessly hated and misunderstood slowly pushes her closer toward hopelessness and despair. Meanwhile, Glinda finally begins emotionally accepting that the only path toward genuine goodness may require sacrificing the very things society always taught her to value, including admiration, comfort, popularity, safety, and public love. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, insecurity, loneliness, emotional manipulation, ambition, and society's obsession with appearances can emotionally destroy truth, compassion, innocence, friendship, and love while transforming misunderstood people into legendary villains within the stories history chooses to remember. Wicked continues as the emotional tragedy surrounding Elphaba, Glinda, and the Kingdom of Oz approaches its most heartbreaking stage while fear and political manipulation completely dominate society. Emotionally, Elphaba feels more isolated than ever because the government's propaganda has successfully transformed her into the ultimate symbol of evil within the minds of ordinary citizens who no longer see the compassionate and emotionally vulnerable woman hidden beneath the frightening legend of the Wicked Witch. Visually, Oz appears emotionally shattered through endless magical storms, glowing green skies, giant public warnings, frightened crowds, military patrols, abandoned fantasy landscapes, dramatic lighting, and haunting cinematography reflecting how fear slowly poisoned every part of the once beautiful magical kingdom. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues secretly protecting innocent talking animals and vulnerable citizens despite emotionally understanding that history may never recognize her sacrifices or true intentions. Emotionally, she feels exhausted, emotionally broken, and deeply heartbroken because everything she ever wanted, including friendship, peace, belonging, love, and acceptance, has been destroyed by prejudice, manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances and fear. However, even through overwhelming emotional pain, she refuses abandoning compassion because helping innocent lives remains the only thing giving meaning to her suffering. Meanwhile, Glinda reaches an emotional breaking point after witnessing how completely the wizard and Madame Morrible corrupted Oz through lies, propaganda, emotional manipulation, and fear-driven politics. Emotionally, she becomes consumed by guilt because she remembers how Elphaba once trusted her friendship before fear, vanity, insecurity, and social pressure prevented her from standing beside the truth. Visually, Glinda's glamorous public identity now feels emotionally hollow despite luxurious palaces, sparkling costumes, magical celebrations, elegant fantasy imagery, and endless admiration because emotionally she understands that popularity and beauty mean nothing when built upon silence and emotional cowardice. Meanwhile, the wizard intensifies his campaign against Elphaba by convincing citizens that destroying the Wicked Witch represents the kingdom's only hope for safety and peace. Emotionally, ordinary people become completely emotionally dependent on hatred toward Elphaba because fear gives society a simple emotional answer for every problem and uncertainty spreading across Oz. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues manipulating magical disasters and emotional panic to strengthen public loyalty toward the corrupt government while ensuring citizens remain too frightened to question authority or confront injustice. Emotionally, Elphaba slowly realizes that society often chooses emotionally comforting lies instead of painful truths because accepting corruption and manipulation feels easier than admitting the world's heroes may actually be villains themselves. Meanwhile, Glinda secretly begins preparing to challenge the wizard's deception because she emotionally understands that remaining silent any longer would destroy whatever goodness still exists inside her heart. Emotionally, this decision terrifies her because exposing the truth could cost her everything society ever taught her to value, including admiration, comfort, security, status, and public love. However, Elphaba's sacrifices and emotional courage inspire Glinda to finally become the kind of morally strong person she always pretended to be in public. Meanwhile, Elphaba and Fiyero share deeply emotional moments together while hiding from the government forces hunting them across Oz. Emotionally, their love becomes one of the few remaining sources of warmth and hope inside Elphaba's painful life because Fiyero sees the real woman beneath the terrifying public image society created around her. Visually, their relationship is portrayed through emotional fantasy landscapes, glowing magical imagery, haunting romantic musical themes, emotional close-up shots, and vulnerable conversations filled with sadness, longing, tenderness, and emotional honesty. Meanwhile, Elphaba admits she fears the world will never remember her kindness or understand the sacrifices she made to protect innocent lives. Emotionally, Fiyero reassures her that truth matters even when society refuses accepting it and that genuine compassion can survive even inside a world consumed by fear and manipulation. Meanwhile, the citizens of Oz become increasingly aggressive and emotionally unstable because years of propaganda transformed hatred toward the Wicked Witch into a form of emotional unity connecting the kingdom through fear rather than truth or justice. Emotionally, this deeply wounds Elphaba because she realizes innocent people genuinely believe her destruction will somehow heal the suffering and instability spreading across society even though the real corruption exists inside the government controlling them. Visually, the emotional atmosphere grows increasingly tragic and emotionally intense through giant magical confrontations, storm-filled fantasy environments, glowing green skies, heartbreaking musical performances. Emotional speeches, dramatic lighting, and emotionally powerful cinematography emphasizing how fear and political manipulation destroyed friendship, innocence, trust, love, and emotional connection throughout Oz. Meanwhile, Glinda finally emotionally accepts that true goodness requires sacrifice, courage, empathy, and honesty rather than beauty, admiration, popularity, or public approval. Emotionally, this realization completely transforms her understanding of herself and the world around her because she now sees how fear and insecurity once controlled nearly every important decision in her life. Meanwhile, Elphaba slowly begins emotionally preparing herself for the painful possibility that she may never escape the terrifying identity society forced upon her regardless of how compassionate or morally courageous she remains. However, despite the heartbreak and loneliness, she still refuses surrendering to hatred because compassion continues defining her far more than fear or revenge ever could. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, insecurity, loneliness, emotional manipulation, ambition, and society's obsession with appearances can emotionally destroy truth, innocence, friendship, compassion, and love while transforming misunderstood people into legendary villains within the story's history chooses to believe. Wicked continues as Oz reaches a point where fear has completely overtaken truth and the boundary between reality and propaganda becomes almost impossible for ordinary citizens to separate. Emotionally, Elphaba is now fully aware that the wizard and Madame Morrible have succeeded in turning her into a symbol of terror not because of what she has done, but because society needed a convenient enemy to justify its fear and obedience. Visually, Oz is portrayed through overwhelming storm imagery, glowing green propaganda signs, massive public gatherings, militarized patrols, broken landscapes, and dark magical atmospheres that reflect a kingdom emotionally collapsing under manipulation and hatred. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues protecting talking animals and escaping prisoners in secret despite knowing every action strengthens the government's narrative against her. Emotionally, she feels completely exhausted and emotionally isolated because even her kindness is rewritten as proof of danger. Yet she cannot stop herself from helping others because compassion is the only part of her identity that remains untouched by propaganda. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains with her and fully commits to resisting the corrupt system even though it places his life in constant danger. Emotionally, their bond becomes stronger through shared suffering, emotional honesty, and the understanding that both of them have chosen truth over safety and acceptance. Visually, their relationship is shown through dark fantasy landscapes, emotional close-ups, storm-lit skies, and soft musical themes that contrast against the violent political world surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda finally makes a decisive emotional shift after witnessing the full extent of the wizard and Madame Morrible's deception. Emotionally, she understands that silence is no longer neutrality but participation in injustice. And this realization forces her to confront the life she built on admiration, beauty, and public approval. Visually, her glamorous world inside Emerald City now feels emotionally suffocating despite its luxury, sparkling magic, and constant attention because everything she once valued now feels built on fear and lies. Meanwhile, she begins quietly challenging the government's narrative by questioning official statements and trying to protect remaining truth in subtle ways without fully exposing herself to political retaliation. Emotionally, this becomes extremely difficult because she still fears losing everything she has ever known, but Elphaba's sacrifice continues haunting her conscience and pushing her toward moral courage. Meanwhile, the wizard tightens control over Oz by escalating propaganda and fear-based messaging, ensuring citizens remain emotionally dependent on the belief that Elphaba is the source of all suffering. Emotionally, this manipulation deepens because people begin accepting hatred as normal and necessary for their own safety. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magic and weather manipulation to create disasters that are then blamed on Elphaba. Further solidifying her reputation as the Wicked Witch, emotionally Elphaba realizes that truth no longer matters in a society where fear dictates belief, and this realization becomes one of the most painful experiences of her life because she once believed honesty and compassion would eventually be enough to change the world. Meanwhile, Fiyero and Elphaba share deeply emotional moments together as they acknowledge the possibility that their future may only exist as fugitives living outside society. Emotionally, their love becomes both a source of strength and a reminder of everything they have lost, including normal life, acceptance, and peace. Visually, these moments are shown through quiet magical settings, emotional musical motifs, glowing green light, and intimate conversations surrounded by danger and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Glinda continues growing internally as she slowly accepts that real goodness requires standing against injustice even when it destroys personal identity and public admiration. Emotionally, this internal transformation becomes painful because she must confront how long she ignored suffering in order to protect her own comfort and image. Meanwhile, Elphaba begins to understand that her legacy will likely never be defined by truth because history is written by those who control fear, power, and information. Emotionally, this realization is devastating but also strengthens her resolve to continue protecting innocent lives even if she is never remembered for it. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear. Wicked continues as the emotional pressure inside Oz reaches a critical breaking point where fear, propaganda, and political control have fully replaced truth in the minds of most citizens. Emotionally, Elphaba now exists as a complete outsider to the world she once tried to protect because every action she takes is immediately rewritten by the government as evidence of her being the Wicked Witch. Visually, Oz is shown as increasingly unstable through violent magical storms, glowing green propaganda flooding the skies, militarized city streets, frightened crowds, collapsing fantasy landscapes, and intense cinematic lighting that reflects a kingdom living entirely under fear-based control. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues her secret resistance by protecting talking animals and helping victims escape imprisonment. Emotionally, she feels emotionally drained and deeply isolated because even her most compassionate actions are used against her to justify more hatred and violence. Yet she continues because stopping would mean allowing injustice to win completely. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains by her side despite being hunted as a traitor by the government. Emotionally, his presence becomes one of the only remaining sources of stability and emotional comfort in Elphaba's life as they both accept that their future may never include safety or acceptance again. Visually, their relationship is portrayed through quiet hidden shelters, storm-lit landscapes, emotional musical themes, and tender moments surrounded by danger and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Glinda undergoes a major emotional transformation as she finally acknowledges that the wizard and Madame Morrible have built their power entirely on lies, fear, and manipulation. Emotionally, this realization breaks the illusion she once believed in and forces her to confront how her silence helped maintain a system that destroyed innocent lives. Visually, her life inside Emerald City appears increasingly empty despite luxurious surroundings, sparkling magic, public admiration, and ceremonial grandeur because emotionally she now sees everything as artificial and built on suffering. Meanwhile, she begins quietly resisting the government's narrative by questioning official propaganda and protecting small truths without openly declaring rebellion. Emotionally, this becomes extremely difficult because she still fears losing her identity, influence, and everything society ever rewarded her for, but Elphaba's suffering continues to push her toward moral awakening. Meanwhile, the wizard intensifies control over Oz by expanding propaganda campaigns that reinforce Elphaba as the ultimate enemy responsible for all chaos. Emotionally, citizens become even more dependent on fear because believing in a single villain allows them to avoid confronting deeper corruption within their own society. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magical manipulation to create disasters that are falsely blamed on Elphaba, strengthening public hatred and ensuring political obedience across the kingdom. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes the world has fully accepted a false reality where truth no longer has power against fear-driven belief. And this understanding becomes deeply painful because she once believed honesty and compassion could eventually change everything. Meanwhile, Fiyero and Elphaba share emotionally intimate moments where they acknowledge the possibility that they may never live normal lives again. Emotionally, their love becomes both a refuge and a reminder of everything they have lost, including peace, belonging, and acceptance. Visually, these scenes are shown through dark fantasy environments, glowing magical light, emotional close-ups, and soft musical storytelling that contrasts against the harsh political world surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda continues evolving internally as she begins accepting that true goodness requires sacrifice, courage, and truth even when it destroys personal comfort and public admiration. Emotionally, this realization forces her to confront her past choices and the emotional harm caused by her silence during Elphaba's suffering. Meanwhile, Elphaba slowly accepts the painful truth that society may never understand her intentions and that her legacy will likely be written by fear rather than truth. Emotionally, this acceptance is heartbreaking but also strengthens her resolve to continue protecting innocent lives regardless of recognition or reward. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can completely reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear and reject. Wicked continues as Oz moves closer to open conflict between the government and those who no longer believe its version of the truth. Emotionally, Elphaba now fully accepts that she will never be seen fairly by the majority of society because fear has already replaced truth in the minds of the citizens. Visually, the kingdom is shown in its most unstable state, yet with violent magical storms, collapsing structures, glowing green propaganda flooding the skies, frightened crowds, and militarized control spreading across every region of Oz. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues her resistance by protecting talking animals and guiding them to safety. Emotionally, she feels deeply exhausted and emotionally worn down because every act of compassion is immediately turned into proof of her supposed wickedness. Yet she still refuses stopping because abandoning them would mean allowing injustice to win completely. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains by her side even though he is now a wanted man. Emotionally, his loyalty gives Elphaba one of the only remaining sources of emotional stability in her life, as both of them accept that their love exists in a world that will never allow them peace or acceptance. Visually, their connection is shown through hidden shelters, stormy fantasy landscapes, soft magical lighting, and emotional musical themes that emphasize tenderness within chaos. Meanwhile, Glinda continues her painful transformation inside Emerald City as she finally begins to understand the full scale of deception used by the wizard and Madame Morrible to maintain control over Oz. Emotionally, this realization shatters the perfect image she once believed in and forces her to confront how her silence contributed to the suffering of innocent lives. Visually, her glamorous world appears increasingly hollow despite luxury, beauty, public admiration, and magical celebration because emotionally she now sees it is built on fear, lies, and emotional manipulation. Meanwhile, she begins taking quiet steps toward resistance by questioning official narratives and subtly protecting truth without openly challenging the government. Emotionally, this internal struggle becomes overwhelming because she still fears losing her identity, status, and everything she was taught to value, but Elphaba's suffering continues to push her toward moral awakening. Meanwhile, the wizard strengthens his rule by escalating propaganda and reinforcing Elphaba as the sole cause of chaos across Oz. Emotionally, this strategy works because frightened citizens find comfort in blaming one individual rather than confronting deeper systemic corruption. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magic to create disasters that are falsely attributed to Elphaba, further intensifying hatred and fear throughout the kingdom. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that truth has almost no power in a society fully controlled by fear and emotional manipulation. And this realization becomes one of the most painful moments of her life because she once believed honesty could eventually change the world. Meanwhile, Fiyero and Elphaba share emotionally vulnerable moments where they accept that their future may only exist outside society as fugitives. Emotionally, their relationship becomes a rare source of hope and humanity in an otherwise collapsing world. Visually, these moments are portrayed through dark fantasy settings, emotional close-ups, glowing green light, and soft musical storytelling that contrasts with the political violence surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda slowly comes to accept that remaining silent now would mean choosing comfort over justice, and that true goodness requires courage even when it destroys popularity and public approval. Emotionally, this realization deeply changes her as she begins confronting her past decisions and the emotional harm caused by her inaction. Meanwhile, Elphaba quietly accepts that she may never be remembered for her compassion or sacrifices because history is controlled by those who manipulate fear and information. Emotionally, this truth is devastating but also strengthens her determination to continue protecting innocent lives regardless of recognition or reward. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can completely reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear and reject. Wicked continues as Oz enters a fully unstable and emotionally fractured state where fear has become the main force controlling society and truth has almost completely lost its meaning. Emotionally, Elphaba now lives with the constant understanding that the world will never forgive or understand her because the image of the Wicked Witch has been permanently embedded into the minds of the citizens through years of propaganda. Visually, the kingdom is shown collapsing under emotional and political pressure through raging magical storms, shattered landscapes, glowing green propaganda flooding the skies, frightened civilians, and militarized forces enforcing the wizard's control across every region of Oz. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues her secret mission of protecting talking animals and guiding them to safety despite knowing that every act of kindness strengthens the government's narrative against her. Emotionally, she feels completely drained, lonely, and emotionally broken because even compassion now carries consequences that deepen her isolation. Yet she refuses abandoning innocent lives because she believes silence would make her complicit in the injustice she is trying to stop. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains loyal to Elphaba and continues risking his life by standing against the wizard's regime. Emotionally, his presence becomes one of the only remaining sources of hope and emotional grounding for her as both accept that they may never be able to live peacefully within society again. Visually, their connection is shown through hidden shelters, storm-lit fantasy landscapes, quiet emotional conversations, and soft musical themes that highlight love existing within chaos and danger. Meanwhile, Glinda reaches a deeper emotional breaking point as she fully recognizes the extent of deception used by the wizard and Madame Morrible to maintain power over Oz. Emotionally, she is devastated because she realizes that her silence and desire for acceptance allowed injustice to spread unchecked while Elphaba suffered alone for telling the truth. Visually, her luxurious life inside Emerald City now feels completely empty despite beauty, magic, admiration, and celebration because emotionally she sees it as a structure built on fear and manipulation. Meanwhile, she begins quietly resisting the government by protecting small truths, questioning official narratives, and trying to prevent further harm without fully exposing herself to political danger. Emotionally, this internal struggle becomes increasingly painful because she is torn between safety and morality. Meanwhile, the wizard intensifies propaganda efforts by reinforcing Elphaba as the ultimate enemy responsible for all chaos in Oz. Emotionally, this strategy succeeds because frightened citizens prefer a simple villain over confronting the complex corruption within their own leaders. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magical disasters and controlled fear to strengthen public hatred toward Elphaba, ensuring society remains obedient and emotionally dependent on government authority. Emotionally, Elphaba slowly realizes that truth has been completely replaced by fear within Oz, and this understanding deeply wounds her because she once believed honesty and compassion could change the world. Meanwhile, Fiyero and Elphaba share emotionally intimate and vulnerable moments where they accept that their love may only survive outside the boundaries of society. Emotionally, their bond becomes a rare source of peace in a collapsing world filled with hatred and manipulation. Visually, these scenes are portrayed through dark magical landscapes, glowing green light, emotional close-ups, and soft musical storytelling that contrasts against the violent political reality surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda begins fully accepting that true goodness requires courage, sacrifice, and honesty even when it destroys her reputation and everything she once valued. Emotionally, this transformation forces her to confront her guilt over remaining silent for so long while Elphaba suffered injustice alone. Meanwhile, Elphaba accepts the painful truth that history will likely never remember her compassion or sacrifices because stories are controlled by those who spread fear and propaganda. Emotionally, this realization is heartbreaking but also strengthens her resolve to continue protecting innocent lives regardless of recognition. Love, or acceptance. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can completely reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear and reject. Wicked continues as Oz reaches a near breaking point where fear has completely overtaken reason and the wizard's control over public belief becomes almost absolute. Emotionally, Elphaba now understands that no matter what she does, the world has already decided who she is, and that identity cannot be changed in a society ruled by propaganda and fear. Visually, the kingdom is shown at its most chaotic through violent magical storms. Collapsing architecture, glowing green propaganda filling the skies, frightened crowds, and heavily militarized forces enforcing obedience across every corner of Oz. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues her hidden resistance by protecting talking animals and helping them escape persecution even as the government intensifies its efforts to capture her. Emotionally, she feels completely exhausted and emotionally broken because every act of compassion is immediately turned into justification for more hatred against her, yet she still refuses abandoning innocent lives because she believes silence would make her responsible for allowing injustice to continue unchecked. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains by her side despite being hunted. Emotionally, his loyalty becomes one of the only remaining emotional anchors in Elphaba's life as both of them accept that their love exists in a world that will never allow them peace or acceptance. Visually, their connection is portrayed through hidden safe spaces, storm-lit fantasy environments, soft magical lighting, and emotional musical themes that contrast with the surrounding political violence. Meanwhile, Glinda continues her painful internal transformation as she fully accepts the truth about the wizard and Madame Morrible's deception. Emotionally, she is devastated because she realizes her silence helped sustain a system that destroyed Elphaba's life while she remained protected by privilege and admiration. Visually, her glamorous world inside Emerald City now feels completely hollow despite luxury, magic, and public celebration because emotionally she recognizes it is built on fear, lies, and manipulation. Meanwhile, she begins quietly resisting the government by questioning official narratives and protecting fragments of truth without openly declaring rebellion. Emotionally, this creates intense conflict because she still fears losing her identity, status, and everything she once valued, but Elphaba's suffering continues pushing her toward moral courage. Meanwhile, the wizard strengthens his rule by increasing propaganda that presents Elphaba as the sole cause of all chaos in Oz. Emotionally, this strategy succeeds because frightened citizens prefer a simple enemy rather than confronting the deeper corruption within their own leaders. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magical disasters and emotional manipulation to reinforce hatred toward Elphaba, ensuring society remains dependent on fear for stability. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that truth has been almost completely replaced by fear within Oz, and this realization becomes one of the most painful truths she has ever faced because she once believed honesty and compassion could eventually change the world. Meanwhile, Fiyero and Elphaba share emotionally intimate moments where they acknowledge that their future may only exist outside society as fugitives. emotionally their relationship becomes a rare source of warmth and stability in an otherwise collapsing world. Visually these moments are shown through dark fantasy landscapes, glowing green magical light, emotional close-ups, and soft musical storytelling that contrasts against the violent political world surrounding them. Meanwhile Glinda finally begins fully accepting that true goodness requires sacrifice, courage, and honesty even when it destroys comfort, popularity, and public approval. Emotionally this realization forces her to confront deep guilt over remaining silent for so long while Elphaba suffered alone. Meanwhile Elphaba quietly accepts that history will likely never remember her compassion or sacrifices because stories are controlled by those who manipulate fear and information. Emotionally this truth is devastating but also strengthens her determination to continue protecting innocent lives regardless of recognition or reward. Visually Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can completely reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear and reject. Wicked continues as Oz descends into its most emotionally extreme and unstable phase, where fear has fully replaced truth and society has become completely dependent on the wizard's propaganda. Emotionally Elphaba now accepts that she cannot escape the identity forced upon her because the world no longer sees her as a person but as a symbol created to carry every fear and problem Oz refuses to understand. Visually the kingdom is portrayed at its darkest point through raging magical storms, shattered landscapes, glowing green propaganda flooding the skies, frightened citizens, strict military control, and collapsing fantasy architecture reflecting a society breaking under emotional manipulation and political control. Meanwhile Elphaba continues her resistance by protecting talking animals and guiding them through dangerous escape routes despite knowing each act of kindness is used to justify more hatred and violence against her. Emotionally she feels completely exhausted, isolated, and emotionally shattered because her compassion has become the very reason she is hunted, yet she refuses stopping because she believes allowing injustice to continue would destroy everything she stands for. Meanwhile Fiyero remains by her side even as the government intensifies its pursuit of both of them. Emotionally their bond becomes stronger through shared suffering, emotional honesty, and acceptance that their love exists in a world that will never allow them safety or peace. Visually their connection is shown through hidden shelters, storm-lit fantasy environments, soft magical lighting, and emotional musical themes that contrast against the violent political chaos surrounding them. Meanwhile Glinda undergoes a major emotional awakening as she fully understands the depth of corruption within the wizard and Madame Morrible's rule. Emotionally she is devastated because she realizes that Elphaba's suffering was not a misunderstanding but the result of intentional manipulation, propaganda, and fear used to maintain control over the entire kingdom. Visually her luxurious life inside Emerald City now appears completely empty despite beauty, magic, admiration, and celebration because emotionally she sees it is built on lies and emotional suppression. Meanwhile she begins quietly resisting the government by protecting fragments of truth and questioning official narratives while still struggling with fear of losing her identity and status. Emotionally this internal conflict becomes overwhelming because she must choose between safety and moral responsibility. Meanwhile the wizard intensifies propaganda campaigns presenting Elphaba as the sole source of chaos in Oz. Emotionally this strategy continues to succeed because frightened citizens find emotional comfort in blaming a single enemy rather than confronting systemic corruption. Meanwhile Madame Morrible continues using magical disasters and psychological manipulation to reinforce hatred toward Elphaba, ensuring society remains obedient through fear. Emotionally Elphaba realizes that truth has been almost completely erased in Oz because fear now defines what people believe. And this realization deeply wounds her because she once believed honesty and compassion would eventually be enough to change the world. Meanwhile Fiyero and Elphaba share emotionally intimate and vulnerable moments where they accept that their future may only exist outside society as fugitives. Emotionally, their relationship becomes a rare source of warmth, stability, and humanity within a collapsing world. Visually, these moments are shown through dark fantasy landscapes, glowing green magical light, emotional close-ups, and soft musical storytelling that contrasts with the harsh political environment surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda finally reaches the point where she understands that true goodness requires sacrifice, courage, and honesty even when it destroys comfort, popularity, and public approval. Emotionally, this realization forces her to confront her deep guilt over remaining silent while Elphaba suffered alone. Meanwhile, Elphaba accepts the painful truth that history will likely never remember her compassion or sacrifices because stories are controlled by those who spread fear and propaganda. Emotionally, this understanding is devastating but also strengthens her determination to continue protecting innocent lives regardless of recognition or reward. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can completely reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear and reject. Wicked continues as Oz enters its most irreversible stage of emotional collapse, where fear is no longer just a tool of control but has become the foundation of how society thinks, reacts, and survives. Emotionally, Elphaba now understands that the world has stopped trying to discover truth and instead only searches for something to blame, which has permanently locked her into the identity of the wicked witch regardless of her actions or intentions. Visually, the kingdom is shown in extreme chaos through violent magical storms, glowing green propaganda covering the skies like a curse, ruined landscapes, frightened civilians, and militarized forces enforcing obedience across every region of Oz. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues her hidden mission of protecting talking animals and helping them escape persecution. Emotionally, she feels completely drained and emotionally shattered because every act of compassion is instantly turned into proof of her so-called wickedness. Yet she continues because abandoning them would mean allowing injustice to fully win. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains with her despite being hunted. Emotionally, their bond becomes deeper and more fragile at the same time because both of them know their love exists in a world that will never allow them peace, safety, or acceptance. Visually, their connection is shown through isolated hideouts, storm-lit fantasy environments, soft magical lighting, and emotional musical themes that contrast against the violent political world surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda reaches her most painful emotional awakening yet as she fully understands that the wizard and Madame Morrible did not simply misunderstand Elphaba but deliberately built a system of fear and propaganda to maintain power. Emotionally, this realization breaks her remaining illusions about the world she once admired and forces her to confront how her silence contributed to Elphaba's suffering. Visually, her glamorous life inside Emerald City feels completely hollow despite luxury, magic, admiration, and celebration because emotionally she now sees it as a carefully constructed illusion built on lies and emotional control. Meanwhile, she begins taking more direct steps toward resistance by protecting truth more openly and questioning government narratives even at personal risk. Emotionally, this becomes extremely difficult because she still fears losing her identity, influence, and everything society taught her to value, but Elphaba's suffering continues pushing her toward moral courage. Meanwhile, the wizard increases propaganda efforts by reinforcing Elphaba as the ultimate enemy responsible for all chaos in Oz. Emotionally, this continues to succeed because frightened citizens prefer simple explanations over confronting the deeper corruption within their leaders. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magical disasters and emotional manipulation to strengthen hatred toward Elphaba, ensuring society remains obedient through fear and division. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that truth has been almost completely erased from Oz because fear now defines what people believe to be real. And this realization deeply wounds her because she once believed honesty and compassion could change the world. Meanwhile, Fiyero and Elphaba share emotionally intimate moments where they accept that their future may only exist outside society as fugitives. Emotionally, their relationship becomes one of the few remaining sources of hope, trust, and emotional safety in a collapsing world. Visually, these moments are shown through dark fantasy landscapes, glowing green magical light, emotional close-ups, and soft musical storytelling that contrasts with the harsh political environment surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda finally accepts that true goodness requires sacrifice, courage, and honesty even when it destroys comfort, popularity, and public approval. Emotionally, this realization forces her to confront deep guilt over staying silent for so long while Elphaba suffered alone. Meanwhile, Elphaba accepts the painful truth that history will likely never remember her compassion or sacrifices because stories are controlled by those who manipulate fear and information. Emotionally, this understanding is devastating but also strengthens her resolve to continue protecting innocent lives regardless of recognition or reward. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can completely reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear and reject. Wicked continues as Oz moves closer to an irreversible point where fear has fully replaced truth and the wizard's control over public belief becomes almost total. Emotionally, Elphaba now understands that she is no longer fighting just the government but an entire system of belief that has been carefully shaped to ensure people accept lies more easily than uncomfortable reality. Visually, the kingdom is portrayed in its most oppressive state, yet through violent magical storms, collapsing architecture, glowing green propaganda dominating the skies, heavily armed patrols, frightened citizens, and dark fantasy landscapes that reflect a society emotionally trapped inside fear. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues her resistance by protecting talking animals and helping them escape persecution despite knowing every act of compassion is instantly used to justify further hatred and violence against her. Emotionally, she feels completely exhausted, isolated, and emotionally broken because even kindness becomes a reason for people to fear her more, yet she refuses stopping because abandoning them would mean allowing injustice to permanently win. Meanwhile, Fiyero remains by her side even though the government has fully marked him as a traitor. Emotionally, their relationship becomes stronger yet more fragile because they both understand that their love exists in a world that will never allow them safety, acceptance, or a normal future. Visually, their connection is shown through hidden shelters, storm-lit fantasy environments, soft magical lighting, and emotional musical themes that contrast against the surrounding political chaos. Meanwhile, Glinda reaches an even deeper emotional awakening as she fully accepts that the wizard and Madame Morrible did not accidentally create injustice but deliberately engineered fear, propaganda, and division to maintain absolute control over Oz. Emotionally, this realization destroys the last fragments of the idealized world she once believed in and forces her to confront how her silence helped sustain Elphaba's suffering. Visually, her glamorous life inside Emerald City feels completely hollow despite luxury, admiration, magic, and celebration because emotionally she now recognizes it as an illusion built on fear and manipulation. Meanwhile, she begins taking increasingly bold steps toward truth by protecting information, questioning official propaganda, and quietly resisting the government even at great personal risk. Emotionally, this struggle becomes overwhelming because she still fears losing her identity, status, and everything she once valued. But Elphaba's suffering continues, pushing her toward moral courage and honesty. Meanwhile, the wizard intensifies propaganda campaigns portraying Elphaba as the sole source of chaos and destruction across Oz. Emotionally, this strategy continues to succeed because frightened citizens find comfort in blaming one visible enemy rather than confronting systemic corruption within their own rulers. Meanwhile, Madame Morrible continues using magical disasters and emotional manipulation to strengthen public hatred toward Elphaba, ensuring society remains obedient through fear and division. Emotionally, Elphaba realizes that truth has been almost completely erased in Oz because fear now defines what people accept as reality, and this understanding deeply wounds her because she once believed compassion and honesty could eventually change everything. Meanwhile, Fiyero and Elphaba share emotionally intimate and vulnerable moments where they accept that their future may only exist outside society as fugitives. Emotionally, their relationship becomes one of the few remaining sources of warmth, trust, and emotional grounding in a collapsing world. Visually, these moments are shown through dark fantasy environments, glowing green magical light, emotional close-ups, and soft musical storytelling that contrasts with the violent political world surrounding them. Meanwhile, Glinda finally accepts that true goodness requires sacrifice, courage, and honesty even when it destroys comfort, popularity, and public approval. Emotionally, this realization forces her to confront deep guilt over staying silent for so long while Elphaba suffered alone. Meanwhile, Elphaba accepts the painful truth that history will likely never remember her compassion or sacrifices because stories are controlled by those who manipulate fear and information. Emotionally, this realization is devastating but also strengthens her resolve to continue protecting innocent lives regardless of recognition or reward. Visually, Wicked continues blending fantasy adventure, emotional storytelling, friendship, romance, political corruption, discrimination, magical mystery, emotional sacrifice, and spectacular musical performances while exploring how fear, propaganda, prejudice, loneliness, ambition, emotional manipulation, and society's obsession with appearances can completely reshape truth and turn compassion into something the world chooses to fear and reject. Wicked continues as Oz reaches a point where the line between truth and illusion has almost completely disappeared. Emotionally, Elphaba now fully understands that she is not being judged for who she is but for the story that has been created about her. And that story has become stronger than reality itself. Visually, the kingdom is shown at its most oppressive through raging magical storms, collapsing fantasy structures, glowing green propaganda saturating the skies, frightened civilians, and militarized control spreading across every region of Oz. Meanwhile, Elphaba continues her hidden resistance by protecting talking animals.